You're listening to the Champions Rugby Show with me, Martyn Hindley, as we celebrate 25 years of what is now the Heineken Champions Cup. A quarter of a century of tournament history has been largely brought to you by television, which gives today's guest the perfect remote control to take us through the archive.
And the Sports Fantasy League team have done it again. They've got the hat-trick. They are European champions for a third time in a row.
He is incredibly knowledgeable, and he invites himself into your living rooms most weekends as well. That's no small thing. A big thanks then to BT Sports' Nick Mullins for joining us on the Champions Rugby Show. Nick, how are you getting on?
All right, thank you, Martyn. I love the idea of inviting myself into people's living rooms, whether they want me or not. I'm coming in and there's nothing you can do about it. But yeah, no, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
The world's changed now, Nick. This is the way that things are going to be now, and we're looking forward to plenty more in the weeks and months that come. So thank you for joining us to look back at your career to date in the European Cup, what is now the Heineken Champions Cup. I mean, first of all, Nick, how did your career in rugby start, and how did it all come about, really?
Well, I've always wanted to be a journalist. That was first and foremost, and radio is one form of journalism. I was a producer at Radio 5 back in the dim and distant days of the early 90s when 5 Live was just starting out. Eventually became a broadcaster because I hung around long commentator. And yeah, I was around broadcasting on Radio 5 when the tournament first started in the mid-90s.
What is the role of a commentator, Nick? And what are your aims at the start of each day? Not just now, but I mean, how have they progressed over time?
God, I think that is such a hard question to answer because I think my role is different in different people's perceptions. What some people want from a commentator isn't what other people want from a commentator, which is why it is so easy for us to annoy some people all of the time. So I think what I'm trying to do is to not get in the way of the action. I'm two things really. One, to promote what we're watching, to add in what way I can to the pictures that we're seeing on the screen, but also not to get in the way too much. You don't want the commentator giving the impression that he's more important than the players we're watching and the games we're watching. So that's, and I could talk for 3 or 4 hours about how we try to do that. But in essence, Martyn, that's what it is, to make your experience of having invested 2 hours in a bit of television watching the Heineken Champions Cup feel better because there's a voice there guiding you, accompanying you through it in some way.
You seem to have a quite fantastic rapport on BT Sport with the likes of Brian O'Driscoll and Austin Healey, etc. How do you go about building up that rapport with your fleet of talent that you work with?
Well, I think first things first, BT have picked, well, not necessarily in my case, but I think they will pick people who are team players, and generally speaking, if you're taking a rugby player, then they've become or always were team players, and we genuinely get on with each other. I think going back to the question about what we would like commentary to be, if it's me, Brian and Austin chatting during a game, I always like to think that we're 3 blokes sitting in the stand watching a game of rugby, and if you were sitting near us, we're not the blokes that would annoy you. You'd want to get involved in the conversation, or you're just happy earwigging on the conversation. We're not talking too much. That's really important on television as well. You can underline that point that actually sometimes the skill comes in knowing when to say nothing, when to shut up, particularly over pictures that are dramatic. You don't need me droning on all the time. But yeah, we like each other, and we're mates off screen, and we enjoy each other's company, and hopefully that comes across in the coverage. And we love rugby, and we love watching it together.
The Heineken Cup started, as you mentioned, in the mid-90s, a few years after the Champions League for the round ball. I mean, do you remember back in those days at the BBC how it was taken up by the media, and basically what your thoughts were around this new cross-border concept?
I do, and I actually remember the first season, which was 95-96, and I've got to be honest that certainly in my little universe, it didn't make a huge impression. I was working on Rugby Special at the time. Inverdale was sitting there in his rugby shirts. You probably remember coming in each week with whatever injury he'd picked up playing fullback for Esher the day before. And I distinctly remember being in the production office on the day that Toulouse beat Cardiff in extra time, I think it was, at the Old Arms Park. And that certainly, even in our world on Rugby Special, passed without a huge amount of fanfare. It was played the first weekend of the new year, and we were literally just passing scores on to Invers when they happened. We certainly didn't take it live. These were the days where English and Scottish clubs weren't involved at the time. And certainly that year, Martyn, there was no hint of what it would grow into, and actually grow into itself really quickly as well.
It must have also been quite difficult in those days to really do quite a lot of research, or quite a lot of detailed research. I mean, we didn't have the multi-channel approach across Europe. There wasn't a great deal of coverage of things that happened outside of your own territory, really. I mean, how on earth, as the tournament got bigger, were you able to start really preparing content and to understand what the likes of Toulouse and Brive were going to bring over 80 minutes?
Well, that was one of the great challenges, because certainly up until that point, people doing my job had only worked within their territory. So if you were a rugby commentator in Wales or Ireland or Scotland, or indeed France, you would only tend to do the club matches from those particular areas. The only time really you'd have a look at other foreign teams, in inverted commas, would be when you were doing Five Nations, as it would have been back then, and certainly in the early years of the World Cup. But that's part of the fun, and that's actually part of what we do as commentators, because I always think that preparation is absolutely key to what we do. Certainly as the main voice commentator, not so much for an Austin or a Brian or a Hugo or a Ben. It's about me providing something, framing the match in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think of, because you're actually doing a proper job during the week. My dad always wonders what I do during the week, when actually I only seem to work on Friday, Saturday and Sunday, or whenever the games are. But actually my job is Monday to Thursday, and the games are just fun.
Well, Mitchell bursts through and he's on his own, but he showed quick feet and he's still going, Drew Mitchell. That is a try of real quality, and Mitchell might just have taken this final beyond the grasp of Clermont.
That preparation was a real challenge early on, not largely because I'm not entirely fluent in French. So if I wanted to get an idea as to how Guy Noves was thinking before a Toulouse match, that took some work. And it was in the days before the internet as well, before we had access to Google and whatever. So yeah, it was a lot of footwork, a lot of phone work, trying to get to as many training sessions as you could, and trying to get to know teams that you'd not covered before, as well as those teams that you've been seeing week in, week out.
Who was your inspiration, Nick?
Oh, well, Bill McLaren was my inspiration. And increasingly, I'm finding, depressingly increasingly, I'm having to explain who dear old Bill was. I remember going along to my daughter's school a couple of years ago and answering that question and looking back over a sea of blank 10-year-old faces, because they'd never heard of dear old Bill. But hopefully most of us listening to this now will know who Bill was. BBC rugby commentator for the best part of 50 years, and was still doing it in his 80s. So Bill, I think for so many of us now doing this job, set the template. And it was certainly Bill who taught me that the best hours spent during a week were spent on touchlines, watching players prepare for matches. So in our own small way as commentators, we are preparing hopefully as assiduously as the players are. So when they run out on a Saturday, we're as prepared as they are. But yeah, Bill was the one, and he was the one who meant that on Fridays now I'm preparing this silly little chart that I do on an A4 piece of paper with all the names written on it and 1,000 things that even their mother might not know about each of them. So yeah, Bill was responsible for this strange little life that we all inhabit these days.
My first Heineken Champions Cup final working at EPCR was fortunately at BT Murrayfield, where of course the press room is still named after the great Bill McLaren, and some fantastic examples on the walls of some of those charts which we could study for a long time. So with all of that in the locker in terms of motivation, experience, inspiration, can you remember your debut when it came to pass in the Heineken Cup as a commentator?
I'm not very good at this. I'm like a goldfish. I struggle to remember the score of a match an hour after it in the car on the drive home. I remember the first final I went to, which was actually, I think, the second final in 1997, January 1997, and English and Scottish clubs, Scottish regions were involved for the first time. And it was played in those days. The final was played before the Five Nations started. And Brive beat Leicester. I grew up in Leicester, and I went along with some mates as a fan, actually. So it was before I was working on the tournament, and we sat behind the posts at the old Cardiff Arms Park, the old National Stadium, and over 40,000 were in. And it's interesting, we were talking about that first final the year before in Cardiff, and that for me, with 40,000 in the Arms Park, was almost the first time that I thought, hang on a minute, this feels like different gravy.
That's the fullback in the line, VR. It could be another try for Cara. A brilliant score. His second try of the match. His 10th try of the tournament. Sebastian Cara has tied it up for Bree. The players have their arms in the air. They're embracing each other. It's 26 points to 9. And that was a brilliant handling attack.
Well, I remember watching a Bree side doing things that I'd never seen a club side do before, and I'd grown up on a Leicester side it was in their DNA to entertain and to run the ball from their own try line. But when you were watching Carbonneau and Penaud, and I remember Carrat on the wing, Vendety, Le Maison in midfield, and Sebastian Villar, who just left smoke trails, vapor trails all over Cardiff that day. That was a good Leicester side, but they were totally torn apart. But I remember coming away from that final, Martyn, thinking, yeah, this tournament is what it's about now. As the club game progresses, we're only a couple of years into professionalism as well for rugby at this point, remember. I thought this is the future of the club game, running alongside the domestic competitions. But I was so energised that day, and that Bree performance remains one of the best I've ever seen.
And they almost managed to back it up the year after in Bordeaux against Bath in that extraordinary final.
Though they would have done. It was John Callard's penalty, wasn't it? An injury time. They would have been back-to-back champions. I'd forgotten about. Yeah. They were an astonishing side. Crikey.
Where do you think that ranks among the most iconic images for you in the history of the European Cup?
Well, I'm not very good at kind of doing top tens. I prefer to see a kaleidoscope of images, and I think the strength of the tournament is that when you close your eyes and try to answer that question in your own mind, some people might see one specific image. I just see a whole jumble, like those Zoom calls that we're seeing at the moment with a patchwork of faces and images, and I see Emil Untermatt lifting the trophy. I see shots of Guy Noves. I see shots of a young Dean Richards in his early days as a DOR, Austin Healey running around with his socks down. And they're just the early years. And I think that's the strength of a competition, that it doesn't, I find it very hard to come up with a number one just because there are so many strong ones, Martyn.
BT Sport is the undisputed home of European club rugby. You've had the opportunity to go back into the archive latterly. Really enjoyed your chats with Austin Healey about those great Leicester Tigers sides of the early noughties. Have you enjoyed going through the archive? And I suppose, do you ever get too much of a chance to embrace nostalgia with such a sort of fast-paced life that you have in the commentary box?
It's been so much fun, and we don't get to look back because clearly you've done your preparation for the 1-2 commentary matches that you're doing that weekend, and then on the Monday you're immediately looking ahead to the following weekend. So I think the guys have really enjoyed it as well. I know Austin was watching his matches. We did. They were all of our key commentators were invited to pick their 2 favourite matches, and Austin, interestingly, surprisingly, picked the 2 games that he was man of the match in, which knocked us all over the fence, to be honest. But 2001 Stade against Leicester at the Parc des Princes, and then he did Leicester Munster in 2002, the match that's become known as the hand of back game. Brian O'Driscoll did a couple of Leinster games, Leinster winning in Toulouse, and then winning against Munster in that semi-final famously at Croke Park a couple of years later. And again, for a lot of them, Martyn, because these are busy blokes who certainly during their playing careers wouldn't have had time to reflect on the match in full. They might have seen clips in the analysis sessions on the Monday afterwards, but they've never sat through the whole 80 minutes. And it was such an interesting experience for both of us. Not that we were next to each other. I was in my kitchen in London, and Brian last week was up in his mansion in Dublin, sitting next to each other, watching these players talk about themselves, which, as you can imagine, is quite an extraordinary thing for them to have to do. And for Brian, I invited Brian to commentate over, you might remember the try he scored against Munster in that semi-final, reading what Ronan O'Gara was about to do with the pass to Paul O'Connell. And Brian's a kid again. And it's lovely because it reminds us why we and they in particular fell in love with this sport in the first place. So it's been such a fascinating experience, and it jogs our memories as well. One of my favourite early games, certainly as a commentator, featured Ulster, and Ulster fans will remember, because we were 20 years on not so long ago from there in 98-99 season. A couple of matches sitting next to the great Willie Anderson, the former Ulster and Ireland captain, at the old Ravenhill, watching games against Toulouse and Stade Francais in the knockout stages. And you talk about images and experiences and feelings, and I can still feel, when I stop to think about it now, I can still feel the old wooden stand that we were sitting in at Ravenhill that day shaking as Ulster closed out both of those games late on, and they'd eventually go on to win the tournament down at Lansdowne Road. They're images that it's what sport's about, isn't it? And it keeps me warm during quiet periods like this. And the players have certainly loved looking back over their old exploits, and we as commentators have enjoyed reliving a few as well.
They got the band back together last year for the 20 years celebration. They got all the Ulster guys in at the Kingspan for the match against Racing, reminiscing, going back onto those experiences against Toulouse and Stade Francais. And there were some fascinating stories looking back to their 20th anniversary of that success, the first for the Irish provinces, who've given so much to the tournaments. Of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, you know what? One of the things. Sorry, Martin. One of the things about these reminiscences as well is that it's not always just about the match that you remember. You remember the trips, and you remember what else was going on around that particular weekend. And one of my strongest memories, not just sporting memories, is I think it was before they beat Leicester, Ulster, memorably 33-0 a year or so later. The game was played on a Sunday, and it created an awful kerfuffle at the time, because there were one or two in Belfast and Ulster who didn't think that sport should be played on a Sunday, and there was a demonstration outside the ground led by Dr. Ian Paisley, the politician. And I remember having to walk through the demonstration to get into the press room, and it's those things that we all have tacked on to sport, isn't it? It isn't just that try-scoring moment or the big tackle. It's the trip to the ground and everything that went around it, and yeah, extraordinary memories.
You must have so many stories of travelling around Europe and in fact around the world to cover rugby. Some which I'm sure are broadcastable, and maybe some which aren't. But I mean, what have you made of things recently in terms of going to new venues for the European Cup? For example, we've been to Bilbao. You've commentated on the Heineken Champions Cup final in Newcastle. Marseille on the agenda in the near future. What have you made of all of those? Are you a traditionalist, or have you embraced those kind of moves?
Actually, I've always considered myself a little bit of a conservative with a small c, a bit of a traditionalist, but I've absolutely loved those places that you've talked about. Lyon, when we went there with Saracens a few years back, because my early memories are of autoroute dashes in between Castres and Perpignan from one Saturday to another, and whatever the speed limit is on those French autoroutes, probably breaking them to get to kick off in time on the Sunday. That's what I think the tournament is about, and I think that's what certainly in the early days I was a supporter. I was travelling to Cardiff to watch my team play Brive in a Heineken Cup final. I think the support. You talk to the supporters about what this tournament means, and of course it means hopefully watching their club be successful. But it's the relationships that are built up between rival supporters. When we did the Leicester Munster rerun a couple of weeks ago, I was inviting people on Twitter to come back with their memories, and so many people came back with memories of sitting next to either Leinster or Munster fans and forming relationships that still last now. And there is something still special between Leicester and Munster that dates back to 2002, and the travelling that they did to get to Cardiff together that day. So for me, it is about the journey. And no, I'm all for it, Martin. I know there are one or two who think it should only stay within specific tried and tested rugby venues, but St James's Park a couple of years ago for Saracens Leinster was one of the great rugby days in my memory. And I was, hopefully we can still get to Marseille at some point. But no, I am a very, very big fan of broadening the sport. And if you have something as special as the Heineken Cup, we all want rugby to grow, then we need to be introducing it to new audiences, new areas whenever we can.
Is it fair to say, Nick, that you coined a few years ago when BT Sport were the outright rights holding broadcaster in the United Kingdom and Ireland, you coined the phrase "Test match rugby in club colours." Is there a better phrase to summarise what the tournament means to you and what it signifies?
No, I think in pure rugby terms, that's what it is. But what we tend to do sometimes is to only look at the tournament through the eyes of the player. And I know that you can certainly look at the development of Northern Hemisphere Test sides over the last 20 years and put an awful lot of credit to that development down to the European Cup, because clearly it doesn't take me to tell you that it has provided that bridge between club rugby and Test rugby. So I think from a pure playing term, that's a decent phrase. But actually, I'm constantly as a commentator thinking about it as I would have done when I was just paying for my ticket to go along as a fan. And I just think it's given rugby as a sport a much broader tapestry. There's much more colour to rugby now because of the Heineken Cup, because all of a sudden Leicester have a rivalry with Munster. Clubs like Leicester used to, in the old days of amateurism, go to Swansea, have their Wales Easter tour each year. That was lost initially with professionalism because we all seemed to contract into our own national leagues. But what the Heineken Cup did was allow professional rugby to flourish. And sure, it was important for the players. But as we're discovering now, when we talk about how we come out of lockdown and whether we play behind closed doors, sport is nothing without the supporters. And for me, I think about the colours, the contrasting colours at the Aviva Stadium. Whenever Leinster have taken games there, I think about those finals in Lyon and St James's Park, and and hopefully Marseille before too long. It's the supporters as well who create this entire intoxicating package. So yeah, it's important for the players, but it's important for us as spectators as well.
Well, Nick, given what you said at the start of the interview, this might be a little bit tricky, the next section, because we understand that you like to see the history of European club rugby tournaments through a kaleidoscope. And I'm going to put you on the spot and ask a few quick fire questions about Heineken Champions Cup greatest. So don't hate me too much at the end of it. The first question is, in all of your experience as a fan, as a professional, as a commentator, a lover of rugby, what's the greatest match in the history of what is now the Heineken Champions Cup?
My God, how do you define? Oh, I cannot give a simple answer to these questions, Martin. So apologies, but how do you define greatest? It depends whether you're a winner or a loser, I suppose. Munster's two winning finals, I think, were the point where the tournament came alive, where it suddenly started to go beyond its usual base. They kickstart the tournament so much, I think, in the 2000s. Leinster Ulster was some game at the Aviva a few years ago. Actually, Racing Toulouse more recently under the roof at the La Défense Arena. Again, it was only a quarter final, but that atmosphere that day was supernatural. But if you wanted one match that, for me personally, was the point that the tournament took off, then I would say Stade Leicester in 2001, Parc des Princes, the hottest day of the year, brilliant finish for Leicester. That, I think, is when the tournament came of age.
Outside to Leon Lloyd. Lloyd has scored his second try. What a magnificent effort. Leicester couldn't have done better. Absolute brilliant that. Lloyd the scorer, his second try. And the only thing was that Martyn Hindley wasn't concerned because he was injured.
Leon Lloyd with that sensational try, 79 minutes in, and a place in Leicester Tigers and tournament history as well. I mean, that Leicester team, as well as the Brive team that you mentioned in '97, they must have a pretty good shot at being your greatest Heineken Champions Cup team down the years. Where did they rank, and who else would you have up there with?
Yeah, you have to look at the winners. So clearly Toulouse, Guy Novas' Toulouse in those early days, Dean Richards, Leicester would be there. Toulon were brilliant with Johnny Wilkinson. They had a bit of cash, but they were still brilliant to watch. And then Leinster more recently. But I still think, for the impact that they made on and off the pitch, and for the impetus I think they gave other clubs to take the tournament as seriously as everybody does now. Then Munster in the 2000s were the complete package. They were not just a brilliant team, 4 finals in 9 years, I think it was, but it was the supporters that I've been talking about before, Thomond Park and all that went with it, the red and white army on the march. They as a team and as a group of fans, I thought really set the tournament alight and pushed it to even greater heights. So I would say Munster.
Lays it back, Chavon save! Oh, it's intercepted. It's Conway, and it's Conway herring for the line against the hooker, and there is only one winner. And Munster regaining the lead before half-time.
Which is your favourite venue to visit and to work at in the Heineken Champions Cup, Nick?
I love this question on Twitter because we're so fortunate to travel around to grounds. And I suspect that when you talk to supporters who haven't necessarily done all of them, I think the Marcel Michelin comes close in the Auvergne. Whenever Clermont are playing there on a big European day, the Marcel Michelin is amazing. Clearly, Thomond Parker mentioned that. Ravenhill back in the day when it was Ravenhill, and the Kingspan now, the Aviva when Leinster are filling it out. I love St James's Park, actually, a couple of years ago, taking it to a new venue. I thought Newcastle as a city and St James's Park were fabulous hosts. I would still go back, however, to the Millennium Stadium, 2002, Leicester-Munster. The noise under the roof that day is a noise that's still in my head today. What's best part of 20 years later? Never heard anything like it. It was a scream at times in that stadium. I still think the Millennium Stadium with the lid on takes some beating.
Nick, I know I've put you on the spot with some pretty impossible questions there. Here's probably one final difficult one. With all that you've achieved in broadcasting and all of the entertainment that you've brought to so many people around rugby, what are your aims still in the industry?
Just to carry on having fun and carry on enjoying it. The toughest thing about broadcasting is to be yourself and to be who you are off the telly when people are listening to you on the telly. And, you know, the loveliest thing that anyone can ever say when we meet is that it's strange. You sound just like you do when you're on the telly, as if I kind of enter teleman mode when I pick up a commentary mic. So just to carry on having fun, Martyn, and to genuinely love what we watch and to feel enormously lucky to get the chance to do what we do. Because I think the moment you stop enjoying it, it's one of Bill McLaren's greatest credits that he never stopped loving the sport. He never stopped loving talking about it and engaging other people in it. So that's my ambition. For as long as I carry on loving it, I'll do it for as long as people are happy to employ me.
Well, we really enjoy the entertainment that you bring to us all around, not just yourself, but also the whole BT Sport team, what you do in the coverage of the tournaments, bringing it to the homes of people, not just in the United Kingdom and Ireland, but around the world as well. It's fantastic to have you around the tournaments, and when we're hearing your voice, we know that there's more European club rugby on the way. So we'll be very, very happy to hear you again very, very soon.
Oh, bless you, Martyn. Thanks. It's been great having a natter, hasn't it? Actually, this is one of the great things about what we're doing at the moment. You know, one of the pluses that we have time to reminisce like this and just to reinforce what we're all missing so much at the moment.
On his own little adventure, but it's charged down. Treadwell! Northern Voices in Dublin.
Well, Mitchell bursts through and he's on his own, but he showed quick feet. That is a try of real quality. He's gathered it back, and if he can get this down, it'll be a try, and it is! And it might be the final now for the champions.